On behalf of the International Institute for Environment and Development, I'd like to invite everybody in the room at the Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework of Climate Change, as well as those of us watching online, to join in this high-level dialogue on debt swaps for climate and nature, a strategic approach to urgent global goals. And we have two speakers in the room with us who will be introduced in a moment, and the rest of the speakers joining virtually from around the world. So we have a fairly packed schedule, but then we'll have hopefully about 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers and discussion, because I'm sure there'll be lots of comments on this important and emerging theme. If you are logged on to the Gigabox platform, please send us your comments and questions, which we will field to the panelists at the end. So we're very pleased to first of all, set out the objectives of the session, which are threefold. First of all, we want to focus from all the presenters and speakers on commitments, as Greta Thunberg set us the challenge to all of us at the COP: no more blah blah. So we want commitments by debtor countries to demand programmatic large-scale debt swaps for climate and nature. We want commitments by creditors to finance programmatic large-scale debt swaps for climate and nature. And we want commitments by international organizations to promote some kind of international initiative on debt, climate and nature, which would learn lessons from the HIPC program and the G20 Common Framework, which have been two large debt initiatives in the past. So those are the challenges we've set ourselves in the session. We know they're a daunting set of challenges, but we hope collectively we can make some progress, both here and in discussions that will no doubt continue beyond. So without any further ado, I'm very pleased to hand over to the Honourable Minister of Finance, Mr. Nadir Hassan from Seychelles. Please, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you, sir. And good afternoon to everybody in the room. So, developing countries are suffering from the triple crisis of debt, climate change, and nature loss. This is and was the story of Seychelles. In 2008, hard hit by the global financial crisis and vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, yet keen to explore the expanse, the potential for sustainable development of our exclusive economic zone. Of course, we have added complication of being categorized as a high-income country, affecting our access to finance. The Seychelles pioneered a debt for nature swap for ocean conservation, a first of its kind. The link between ocean and climate is one that has always been obvious to us as islanders. In the negotiating rooms, these conversations are still ongoing. We know and have always known of the importance of the ocean to support our adaptive capacity and to build resilience, but also critical habitats like seagrass meadows that provide an important ecosystem service to sequester, absorb, and store carbon from the atmosphere. Seychelles Debt for Nature Swap brought together the government of Seychelles, the Nature Conservancy, and the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust, SECAT, in a US $21.6 million debt buyback. This deal has supported the development of a comprehensive marine spatial planning process that has led to the identification of more than 410,000 kilometers square of marine protected areas. We announced to the world in 2020 that we had protected 30% of our exclusive economic zones. The debt swap proceeds are managed through SECAT and provides a sustainable flow of funds financing efforts of coastal communities to also participate in the protection and restoration of critical resources. This 20-year deal also include investment in an endowment that will mature in 2036, providing another flow of funds to support our ocean and climate ambition. With the debt swap proceeds, we are financing nature and climate key performance indicators, including policy commitments from our national biodiversity strategy and action plans. We are undertaking the mapping and rehabilitation of mangroves, research on keystone species like the parrotfish, and understanding the connectivity of coral reefs across our exclusive economic zones. Further, with the proceeds of the debt swap, we are addressing threats to our marine biodiversity. Marine pollution is one that continues to loom. We were able to support a group of young people to spend 5 weeks on our UNESCO World Heritage Site, Aldabra, where 25 metric tons of marine plastic pollutions were removed. We estimate that 52% by weight of the marine plastic pollution on Aldabra is fishing, ghost gear, discarded and lost rope, nets, and buoys. And the next heaviest categories are flip-flops. 55,000 pairs of flip-flops found on our Paradise Jewel. It is this very political will and realization of the importance of our partnership that has led us to further ambitious commitment in our revised NDCs. In our updated NDC, we have pronounced our intention to pioneer new technologies to map seagrass ecosystem across our entire EEZ. And subject to external support, we will further build upon our existing work to protect 30% of our EEZ and commit to ensuring that at least 50% of our coastal wetlands are protected by 2025 and 100% by 2030. We have recognized in our NDCs the importance of financing opportunities to support our ambition. Another debt swap is something my team and I have been discussing. It would provide us with a much needed investment to support our renewable energy and marine conservation goals. As Seychelles, having pioneered and done the first, we are also committed to share knowledge and experience transparently with other countries and serve as a model. One lesson already learned, it is the importance of skill, and without it, the challenges that accompany. Friends, we are here to share. We therefore look forward to continue working with our partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. So we've heard there how Seychelles has set a trailblazer with their debt for climate swap. The challenge now is to go from swapping $30 million to swapping $300 million or even $3 billion. So we want to really face this challenge of upscaling and taking a much more comprehensive approach, linking up all the different creditors in a comprehensive package linked to key performance indicators for climate and nature. And we are very privileged to have with us a number of speakers representing the different creditor groups who will be talking about how they can receive assurances from the debtor countries that the key performance indicators will be met so that they can engage with these broader upscaled climate for nature debt swaps. So we're now very pleased to turn to our next Honourable Minister of Finance, this time from another part of the world, from Asia, speaking from his capital in Asia, in the Maldives, the Honourable Mr. Ibrahim Amir, Minister of Finance of Maldives. Please, you have 10 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, with the majority of our islands lying less than a meter above sea level, the Maldives is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change and severe weather patterns. With the changes we are witnessing today, there has been a significant increase in what we have to spend on climate mitigation and adaptation over the past decade or so. To provide some context, in 2011, we spent around $2.9 million, or approximately 0.4% of total government expenditure on mitigation and adaptation projects. This increased steadily over the years, and in 2019, we spent $66.1 million, or 3.5% of government expenditure during that year on climate change mitigation and adaptation. Climate mitigation and adaptation has become an area in which we have no choice but to allocate resources to, for our very survival depends on this. But doing so cuts into our fiscal space and constrains our efforts to grow the economy and develop as a nation. The burden on our financing requirement was especially felt during the COVID-19 pandemic, in which we were among the most affected countries worldwide. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic is expected to reverse most of the developmental gains we have achieved over the past few years. The year 2019 saw our real GDP increase by 7% in comparison with an average of 6.4% over the previous 5 years. However, with the closing down of our borders and shutting down of the tourism sector, for the first time in 40 years, we experienced an economic contraction of around 33.5% in 2020. Government revenue declined by around 50% compared to the budgeted levels, and despite the strict expenditure reduction measures, the fiscal deficit increased markedly. Our public and publicly guaranteed debt to GDP ratio jumped from 79% to 150% in 1 year, partly due to the widening deficit, but mostly due to the sharp contraction of nominal GDP. And after 2 difficult years on account of our success in containing the spread of COVID-19, the gradual pickup of the global economy, and the support we have been providing to the domestic economy, we have now managed to turn our focus on the path to recovery. We anticipate that we can only attain pre-pandemic levels in terms of economic activity in 2023, and it will take much longer to address the increase in public debt, as although the debt to GDP ratio is expected to come down to 122% by the end of this year, the decline after this will be more gradual with the fiscal consolidation measures that we have in place. Ladies and gentlemen, our public debt portfolio, excluding the guaranteed debt, currently stands at around $5 billion, and an increase of 42% when compared to debt levels at the beginning of 2020. 60% of our direct debt is held by domestic creditors, while the remaining 40% held by external creditors. The $2 billion outstanding external debt consists of buyer's credit facilities and debt from multilaterals and bilateral sources, which are mostly on concessional terms. Only the remaining 13% of the external debt is non-concessional terms, that we have raised through the issuance of bonds and sukuks in the debt capital markets that is currently trading at a premium. Maintaining the debt sustainability in the post-pandemic recovery is paramount for Maldives. 2 years after the emergence of the pandemic, we have formulated and presented a fiscal policy pathway that would reduce deficits and debt over the medium term. We will pursue fiscal consolidation and raise revenue, at the same time prioritizing productive investments that would improve welfare and stimulate economic activities. From the perspective of Maldives, any form of debt restructuring that effectively closes off access to international debt capital markets and negatively impacts our credit rating is not an attractive proposition for us. With our limited access to multilateral funding and substantial funding needs for investments in climate adaptation, economic recovery, and economic diversification, we need broader access to finance. Unless the international community offers sufficient and competitive alternatives for market financing, any debt restructuring that precludes access to international debt markets is unacceptable for Maldives. Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here to deliberate on the role of debt swaps to address climate financing challenges. I believe that debt swaps will be useful for countries with existing high-cost debt on their portfolios. This is not something that is relevant for Maldives, though, as nearly 90% of our external debt portfolio is at concessional or close to concessional terms. But I think there is a more pressing issue at hand, one that I think is more worthy of our deliberation and urgent action. The issue is general lack of availability of climate financing. Since 2011, we have spent close to $340 million on climate mitigation and adaptation projects. With the increase in need to channel resources to environment-related projects year by year and climate-related financing options not readily available, we have to resort to other more costly avenues. The previous pledge to provide $100 billion annually by developed nations to developing countries to tackle climate change issues has still not materialized, and as a vulnerable country, we are forced to utilize our own very limited resources. I believe it is only fair that these funds be provided to us through a retroactive financing mechanism for which we have spent over the years for something we are not responsible for. This must be provided as grants or at extremely concessional terms to victims of climate change like us, which will in turn reduce the debt servicing cost that was the result from the past borrowings to implement climate mitigation and adaptation measures. I welcome the decision by G20 countries to pledge around $45 billion to channel part of their recent SDR allocation to the IMF Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. I also welcome G20 countries' call on the IMF to establish a new resilience and sustainability trust that will enable climate vulnerable countries like us to obtain long-term financing and resources to support the mitigation and adaptation efforts. We are determined to continue our battle against climate change, but if we are to survive, we must ensure the assistance pledged to help small state nations overcome their vulnerability does not remain just a number on paper. With that, I will conclude my remarks. Thank you all for listening and attending this event. I also thank the organizers of the event for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Amir. So thank you, Minister. You've laid down the challenge both of the need for grant financing, but also how to look at swaps without losing access to the markets and possible ways of blending swaps and restructuring with rolling over debt and access to new bond issuance. But I'm now going to turn to an expert in international finance. We're very pleased to have with us virtually Professor Stephanie Griffis-Jones, formerly of IDS, or I think also at IDS, but now a professor at Columbia University in New York, in the US. So Stephanie, maybe you can handle these issues of how to upscale debt swaps and the challenge laid out by the minister from the Maldives. And you have 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and Paul, and thank you very much for the invitation to this really distinguished panel, also with friends, so I'm delighted to be here. Before I start my presentation, I want to briefly react precisely as you suggested, to the distinguished Minister of Finance of Maldives, and to say that I see these debt for nature swaps as a complement and not a substitute to new funding for debt distressed countries, and of course, non-debt distressed countries cannot focus on accessing new finance. And I see this particularly in terms of, as you mentioned, the issue of SDRs and hopefully a transfer of new SDRs from developed to developing countries, which would complement the existing allocation, and also an increased role for multilateral and regional development banks, which would provide new funding. And if possible, access to private capital markets, as you have mentioned. So I want to refer to the latter point about access to private capital markets towards the middle of my presentation. I think we're discussing here the main concept being a debt swap for climate and nature, which is that for those countries who have unsustainable levels of debt, as recognized by the international community, and who therefore require debt relief, so they have enough fiscal space to deal with the health crisis and the social spending necessary resulting additionally from COVID, to support a green and inclusive recovery, and also to allow to make the urgent investment in mitigation and adaptation that you have so well illustrated, both ministers, which are required given the climate emergency. So I think the idea is to explicitly link a meaningful part of any debt relief, when it is required, to invest in climate adaptation and mitigation. So I would like to highlight that in 2020, Eurodata showed that external public debt service is higher currently in 62 countries than the health spending of those countries, which I think is really very serious. Of course, as was pointed out, the debt service level had already been high before the pandemic hit, but now has increased significantly at the same time as the climate change and its negative effects has been happening much faster and with more negative effects than when the contracts of debt were initially established. So that is why I think there's been a lot of support for this idea of debt for climate swap among civil society, amongst think tanks, in the UN, within the IMF and the World Bank, and I think very interestingly from the V20 vulnerable countries and their presidents. And they have designed a proposal which I think draws, and we're delighted on a study that we did with Paul's, Akhtar, Gallagher, and myself with the Burl Foundation. And these are the following elements. The first is that debt for climate swaps should be on a significant scale. We're not talking about very desirable and nice debt climate swaps that were done in the past, like we heard the very interesting one done in Seychelles, but something that would be scaled up and would contribute to funding budget support in those countries. And the spending will be based on the country's own plans to achieve climate resilience and prosperity. So I think that's the first point that is important to highlight. I think the second point is that there will be, based on a debt sustainability analysis, which will be comprehensive and enhanced, carried out by the fund and the bank, but which would integrate climate risk and climate resilience benefit, as well as include estimates for increased investments in climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, which, as both ministers have highlighted, has been very high. A second element is that the debt relief granted, based on this debt sustainability analysis, would be sufficiently large as meet the needs of the country and equivalent from public and private creditors. Equivalent from public and private. Thirdly, and I think this deals more precisely with the point that the concern that rightly the Minister of Maldives has expressed, enough incentives will be given to encourage sufficient debt relief for private creditors whilst keeping them happy. And we have suggested a concrete mechanism building on the experience, the positive, very positive experience of the Brady Plan in the late 1980s and adapted it a bit. So the idea is to have a guarantee facility which could be housed in the World Bank on the new debt, which would have a significant haircut. So it would imply significant debt relief, but it would be swapped for a better instrument with a lower debt, but with a guarantee of the World Bank. So for a private creditor, they would take a haircut, which nobody likes, but that new debt and debt service would be guaranteed by the World Bank. And they could also feel happier because they're contributing to save the planet. I think we have to worry about banks and bondholders also feeling happy and feeling that they are contributing to the world economy. More technically, this guarantee could cover, as in the case of the Brady Plan, for example, 18 months of interest payments and then be rolled over, plus guarantee the full value of the new principal. And it could be complemented by measures, again, which were taken in the past, such as regulatory and taxation changes and more persuasion by creditor governments, which would also encourage and push private creditors to do this. And I think that this mechanism, if we look, for example, at the Brady experience of the major Latin American debtors in the Philippines and other countries, actually led to a return of private capital flows to these countries, because they were seen as more creditworthy once the debt relief was done. And there were also new actors. In this case, it was institutional investors which entered these markets because so-called Brady bonds were actually very attractive and were traded in secondary markets. So I think a good solution for debt relief where it is needed should actually enhance the prospects of new money. I think one element, we don't maybe have time to discuss it in depth, but I think it's very important, is the role of rating agencies. Because I think there has to be a dialogue between the international community, both debtor countries, IMF, World Bank, and so on, to see, whether how credit rating agencies could be modified so that if debt relief is being granted in ways that will increase future debt capacity of the debtor country, the country wouldn't be downgraded. Because I think it is a legitimate concern of this. So in following this granting of debt relief, the country receiving it would develop a sort of climate prosperity plan, as the V20 call it, to map out the actions they would take to advance development and climate goals, consistent, of course, with the SDGs and the agreements reached in Paris and in Glasgow. There would be some kind of mediation, some kind of coordination committee, which would evaluate this plan, involve both debtors and creditors, fund in the bank, and chair a committee to supervise implementation. And as I said, this successful debt restructure with the money well invested could facilitate countries regaining access to capital markets, as has happened in the past, not just in Latin America, in the case I gave, but also in other experiences. Why? Because debt would be more sustainable, countries could grow faster, and their model of development could be more environmentally and socially sustainable. So this should overcome this problem with the rating agencies. And the whole world would be better off. The debtors, of course, would benefit because they could adapt to climate change. They could become more resilient. The creditors would lower the level of future stranded assets on their books because the debt relief would be used to increase investment, which is resilient to climate change and which is resilient to the shocks of a green transition. So I think it would be a good idea to have this as a component of a climate emergency pact emerging from the COP, as the V20 do, and contribute thus to the need for finance. But I want to finish by insisting that this is only one weapon in our armory. There is no silver bullet in this, and that we would have to walk on two legs, new money, as the minister said, and debt relief for those countries that have unsustainable levels of debt relief. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Okay, so now we've heard from our two ministers from their different respective standpoints in Seychelles and Maldives, both facing the challenges of fiscal, lack of fiscal space. They need money for COVID relief, for vaccines. They also need money for climate and nature. Hopefully these swaps will be linked, as I said, to budget support and key performance indicators, which will allow fiscal space as well as achievement of these key performance indicators. But to tell us how the creditors view this and how they might be able to take forward some kind of initiative, preferably a coordinated international approach, we're first going to, very pleased and honored to have with us Dr. Jeremy Zietelmeier, who's a director at the Strategy Department of the International Monetary Fund. Jeremy, you have the floor, if you don't mind, for 5 minutes to keep time for questions at the end.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. So I'm very honored to be on this panel. And let me just say straight out that obviously I cannot speak for the creditors. I can only speak for the fund, and even at the fund, these are very new ideas. So very largely I'm speaking for myself here. Let me first say that I agree with a lot of what Stephanie has said. So I also think that climate swaps are a useful tool, that they are an important tool, that they should be scaled, that they can play a much bigger role. I'm sorry, I hear a lot of interference. Maybe something can be muted. And I also think at the same time that they're not the only tool, so that we also need deep debt relief with what you might call conventional instruments. And of course, we need new climate finance. And so broadly, the role that we see for debt climate swaps is as a special kind of climate finance instrument, so less as a debt relief instrument, namely as one that provides a fiscal support element in addition to providing access to finance, right? And this is obviously something that most that green bonds or other forms of climate related lending does not have. These are maybe low cost forms of finance, but they continue to be lending. Whereas, what many countries need is an element of fiscal support, and debt climate swaps can provide that fiscal support. So the main, I think, use of debt climate swaps would be in the type of setting that I think Minister of Finance Amir had in mind, for countries with sustainable debts, but that lack fiscal space. So debt might be sustainable, but only at the expense of suppressing really important public investments, including climate investments. I should qualify this a little bit. So as we've just seen in the case of Belize, I think there is also a useful role for, climate-linked type contracts, if you wish, or debt relief commitments as a way of mobilizing additional creditor support, in settings where you have a very attractive project like the reefs in protection in Belize or in Seychelles, the marine protection. And moreover, I think another important qualification where indeed, climate action, the link between debt relief and climate action could be really important in deeply unsustainable debt situations. It is, of course, cases where the lack of debt sustainability is a cause of climate, right? In that case, climate action should be part of the debt relief package that reestablishes debt sustainability. Okay, so with this out of the way, the main problem, as you and others have said, Paul, is the low scale of the debt nature swaps that we have seen in the past, so the closest analogy to what we want. And this has to do with the fact that these were typically very small projects that were expensive to structure and monitor. So according to UNDP, the cumulative total of debt swapped in the past has been something in the low single-digit US dollar billions, which is, of course, ludicrously small compared to the types of volumes that we need. And so the big question is, how do we raise those scales? And so I'm sympathetic to kind of actions on the supply side of the type that are mentioned in Stephanie's and Uli Folz's and co-authors' report. So the Brady bond idea, partial guarantees. So I think there is a rationale for IFIs, MDBs to finance the purchase of this type of collateral or provide the partial guarantees. That has been done in the past. And of course, it is a reflection of the fact that these climate actions provide global benefits. And, MDBs, I think, are well placed to internalize those global benefits and at the same time help expand the investor base that is interested in these swaps by making sure that the risk is acceptable to a broad swath of institutional investors, for example. For the most part, however, I think that if we're really going to scale swaps, it has to come from the other side, from the users of the swaps side. And so here we're going to have to move to modalities where things do not that go beyond identifying very small individual projects. And so in principle, I think there are three ways to go. So there are some countries, for example, countries with very large decarbonization needs due to the need to shut down coal-fired power plants and create a whole new energy sector, where you could have a whole bundle of projects and you can combine it with relevant policy actions, and then you can support this bundle with a debt climate swap. So this is one, but this remains special to like the structure of the problem. The second big approach is one that Stephanie alluded to, but you actually proposed, Paul, in a paper of yours, which is what you call a programmatic approach. So this is the idea that you interpret debt climate swaps in the same way as, in effect, a budgetary use of proceeds instruments. So you support whole categories of budgetary spending. Now, the trick about that is that you need to have confidence on the side of the donor or creditor that the money actually goes to these budgeting categories and that the spending is well targeted, that it helps solve the problem and so forth. So you need a bit of a governance and monitoring structure to make this happen, which could be a challenge, but is certainly feasible. And then the third and probably arguably biggest area is to link swaps to climate metrics, deforestation argument, rather than to uses of funds. And so here, in a sense, the climate swap agenda pretty much coincides with the sustainability-linked bond agenda. In terms of the uses, this is the same agenda. It's only the sources of finance that are different. Right? In one case, it's new money. In the other case, it is debt relief. So let me maybe just say a little bit about the role of the IMF. So we are not in the business of providing partial guarantees. This is something for MDBs. But I think there's still quite a lot the IMF could do in this area. One relates to the use of a more programmatic approach. So I think we can help debtor countries who want to attract such swaps create a governance system and public management, public finance management systems, public investment management assessments that solve the monitoring and governance problems around programmatic swaps. So that this could be one one line of work. The other line of work is related to the Resilience and Sustainability Trust that someone mentioned. So we are creating this using special drawing rights we channeled from the general SDR allocation of the summer. And hopefully the trust will be ready sometime next year. And this could support climate-related reforms financially, together with NDB and World Bank contributions and parallel, policy lending by these institutions. And so here the key point, I think, is that we can align the climate-related reform content of these packages in a way that would also support, and if you like, suck in debt climate swaps by making sure that the reforms that we have in there relate to the KPIs that in turn are attractive for investors and for debt swaps. And of course, one advantage of having these types of reform packages is that they provide a commitment device that helps countries actually make it credible that reforms are in place that make KPIs realistic, and as such, they can then expect the type of fiscal transfer that is associated with a credible commitment to a target. So let me maybe stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was really helpful. So thank you. Now we turn to Germany. The Dr. Jürgen Sattler, who was former executive director at the World Bank on behalf of Germany in Washington, D.C. He's now moved back to his home country, and he's Director General of the Ministry of Cooperation and Development in Germany. And as far as I understand from German politics, although he's the top civil servant in the ministry, he currently has no minister. Now, we know what civil servants do when they have no minister. Let's hear from Dr. Jürgen what he feels about this important topic. Please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. And I can tell you what they do. In those situations, usually they do not say anything without guidance from above. But I'll try hard to not to follow this habit. So I would like to start saying that I think we are sharing the analysis. I would also agree that debt, climate, and the biodiversity crisis really require decisive action. Time is clearly not on our side. We see sovereign over-indebtedness constrain fiscal space for public investments in much needed transformation. And regarding the proposal on the table, I really like that it builds on past experience, in particular the HIPIC, the MDRI, but also the Brady bonds, which were partly a success. So it's always good to learn from lessons of the past. And in some way, the situation is similar, but other things have changed, like in particular the creditor landscape, with more non-Paris Club creditors, more private creditors, which make the situation much more complex. And also a new institutional setup with a common framework, the DSSI, and so on. What hasn't changed is we always say that we need realism in our support, for example, with regard to IMF packages, but this is still, I think, a challenge. And this is, of course, clearly linked to the lack of funds around. It all costs if you are more realistic and perhaps then need more external funding. But there is another change we really appreciate, is that in the meantime, the IMF has acknowledged that climate change is macro-critical. And this also means that debt sustainability analysis and debt treatment have to take into account debt vulnerability to climate change and also environmental degradation, biodiversity loss. It is important to acknowledge debt and nature are interlinked. Constrained fiscal space impedes investments in nature and also in climate protection, while the loss of natural capital poses a significant threat to the economic and fiscal stability of many indebted countries. So that's a kind of vicious circle. More specifically with regard to the proposal on the table, the general approach of debt swaps is intuitively convincing. It is also very sophisticated, the proposal which we have in front of us, and very positively builds on existing experience, as I have mentioned. And I can really say that we continue to support those reflections. I think we need fresh thinking. However, like you say in the UK, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And I think most of you are sitting in the UK, therefore. And this means the challenge is implementation and operationalization of the approach. And there we still see some challenges and caveats. For example, if debt sustainability is regarded as ability to service debt, then there is no additional fiscal space to be used in this dedicated virtual fund. This would call for policy reforms. So you can avoid this problem if you trigger policy reforms and not additional investments to be discussed. Then how it articulates the proposal with a common framework is also an issue we have to look at. It should not really undermine, but be complementary to the common framework. And also we have to be clear about what type of debt we are talking. For example, Germany's bilateral instrument only covers ODA claims and is limited in scope. Swaps on official bilateral non-ODAs or commercial claims have traditionally been kept by the Paris Club to limit free riding. And then it might not be a surprise to you that we are skeptical with regard to rescheduling multilateral debt or canceling multilateral debt. The MDRI was not such a great experience. It was very costly, and there are clear opportunity costs with that. So that's another issue. And then an important issue is how to maintain the transparent use of additional resources, if we talk about additional resources. So there we really need clear incentives and transparency. And looking back, we have seen how challenging this was in the past, for example, with regard to IDA and the implementation of IDA's non-concessional borrowing policies. Then there are some issues with regard to international law and the readiness, the needed readiness of other institutions, like, for example, financial regulators, to participate and to play their part. So at the end, I really wonder if we should stick to the notion that we are talking here about unsustainable debt, or if it wouldn't be easier to apply, or perhaps to also apply this kind of approach to countries with perhaps challenging debt situation, but not unsustainable debt. If I understand correctly, that's also a point Jeremy has made, but the transmission line wasn't very good. So again, to summarize, this is a very, very important contribution to the debate. We are very open to discuss that further. We have to look at how to operationalize it, and there we still see major challenges. Thanks a lot. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. So Jürgen, in his remarks, alluded to the fact that the credit landscape is very different now than it was 20 years ago when the highly indebted poor country initiative was started, when it was largely Paris Club creditors. The two main changes is we now have in both low-income and emerging economies, but in particularly low-income, a lot of Chinese debt, but also debt from the private sector. So we're very honored and pleased to have with us Sonia Gibbs, who's Managing Director of Sustainable Finance at the International Institute for Finance, and she can tell us about how they represent a huge number of private creditors in developing countries. Sonia, you have 7 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you all for having us here today. Can you hear me? I'm not sure yeah, great, okay. You've all been very patient. We've had a lot of excellent speakers on these topics, which are complex and challenging to understand. But let me just say a couple of words about what the IIF is, the Institute for International Finance. We represent private creditors around the world, 450 members, 70 countries, including over half of our members are from emerging markets. So we represent the whole spectrum of borrowers and creditors, including multilateral development banks, development finance institutes. So we're a broad tent, a broad umbrella. This is such an important discussion and so timely with COP. You've got these three interrelated challenges, a huge buildup of global debt, the climate considerations, the need to protect natural capital and biodiversity. So this is the perfect discussion at the right time. You know, so before I share with you some of the private sector perspectives in financing, let me give you some context on the engagement of the private sector in the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which has some really interesting lessons to learn in how best to engage private creditors, including on large-scale debt for nature swaps. So this is such a central theme for COP, how private creditors, what they can do, what's their role in financing a just transition for emerging and developing economies. To enable sustained flows of private capital, markets need to work, and borrowing countries need market access. And this was mentioned by Stephanie earlier. So market access is a key consideration. So just to note that in April of last year, the IIF was called upon to bring in private creditors to support the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative. And while direct private creditor participation was challenging, not least because of the negative credit ratings implications of the DSSI and the risk of losing market access, I would note that private creditors through bond and loan markets provided substantial new financing to address these liquidity challenges that the debt service suspension was designed to address. So in short, we saw tremendous appetite among our members to help vulnerable countries with debt service problems. And I believe that the same appetite can be built with regards to large-scale debt for nature and debt for climate swaps. Let me turn to my second point here, which is the rapid growth of ESG considerations in investing, in particular investing in emerging markets. This is just absolutely transformative. I'm dating myself, but I've been in this business for over 25 years, and I've never seen anything like the way that global fixed income markets, global debt markets are transforming because of ESG considerations. Climate change is absolutely top of the global policy agenda. This whole race to net zero emissions means that global investors, your BlackRocks, your Fidelities, your State Streets, they're going to have to decarbonize and green their portfolios, and that means they're going to have to scale up climate finance. And we've all heard about the $100 billion annual commitment, but much, much more is needed, trillions rather than billions. So the whole landscape for ESG investing and emerging markets investing is changing out of all recognition. And at the same time, though, emerging markets and low-income economies are under increasing pressure to accelerate their own transitions to a low-carbon economy. And improvements in climate change resilience should really help companies tap international debt markets at more favorable rates. So, for example, the kinds of debt for nature, debt for climate swaps that we've been talking about today, by freeing up the fiscal space for spending on ESG priorities, should really boost resilience and support growth. And this is good for creditors as well, right? It's a win-win type of situation. So there's a lot to like in debt for nature and debt for climate swaps. When you have, unfortunately, there are cases where debt restructuring becomes inevitable, debt for nature swaps can provide a relatively easy exit from debt payments that are at a high risk of default. But I want to emphasize that for the private creditors, these swaps, by lowering the debt ratios, actually improve the creditworthiness of the borrower, ultimately. Obviously, there's an initial hit from the lack of payment, but they will ultimately improve the creditworthiness of the borrower and therefore the long-term value of these investments. And that's a point I want to emphasize, that global investors are turning so much to the concept of what is fiduciary duty for an investor? Is it about just the short-term returns, maximizing those, or is it about protecting the long-term value of your investment? And that's a big, big change, in the way that investors are thinking. So like any other ESG-aligned commitment, debt for nature swaps can support a country's credit trajectory, and that helps justify the creditor's provision of debt relief. So I think that's an important point to make. Ultimately, it improves a country's credit. But there are challenges in making all this work, right? So sovereign debt restructuring has generally not incorporated ESG considerations, despite very strong efforts on the part of some investors to make this happen. For example, in the case of Argentina, there was a lot of effort to get these considerations incorporated. Some of these one-off developments, so for example, the case of the Seychelles, as was mentioned earlier, and the proposed blue bonds that Belize has going in the restructuring, those are really an encouraging signal of progress and the way thinking is changing. So let me just end here, Paul, with a few ideas for improvement on how, when you're thinking about how do you incorporate ESG considerations into any debt instrument, including the debt for nature swaps. So first of all, from a private creditor perspective, there needs to be an improvement in commitment mechanisms, because these restructurings are not new money transactions. They're going to require the borrowers to commit to certain actions in the future, and there needs to be a mechanism to get this to happen. So second, it's clear that if there's going to be debt relief to be provided in exchange for ESG commitments, there's got to be a monitoring and enforcement mechanism. So how do you know that you're actually going to get the ESG impact that you've been looking for? If the borrower doesn't adhere to those commitments, if they don't live up to what they've promised, there needs to be some kind of enforcement mechanism. And third, we just need better transparency and monitoring of impact. Incorporating ESG criteria into any kind of market debt instrument, whether when you first issue it or if it's restructured, the idea is to improve ESG outcomes, whether those are climate or social, whatever they are. But without any transparency or better transparency on where and how much governments spend on each of these priorities, market participants won't have a complete picture of the impact that they're getting for their debt for nature swap or debt for climate swap or whatever the instrument is. And if investors can't gauge impact, determining how much debt relief to provide in exchange for ESG commitments becomes really subjective and hard to measure. And that raises concerns about potential greenwashing or blue washing. Investors simply don't want to have that liability. So we need better transparency and monitoring of impact. So let me just end by underscoring the point that I made early on, that the private sector really stands ready, increasingly so, to support efforts to provide sustainable finance to emerging markets, including through debt workouts and innovative, mutually beneficial structures like debt for nature swaps, including with the use of guarantees, as Stephanie mentioned. I thought that was a very interesting reflection on this. So when executed in a collaborative and transparent way, debt for nature, debt for climate swaps can also help establish a strong foundation for ESG engagement with sovereigns, which is absolutely critical in building investor appetite. And it also expands borrowers' access to global markets. So ESG engagement is really critical in building a foundation for deeper and more targeted ESG KPIs in the future. So I'll stop there, Paul.
Great, thanks a lot, Sonia. Really fascinating to hear about this kind of transformative shift in the private sector from seeing this tool perhaps as an obstacle to one which could be welcomed for the ESG opportunities that it provides and for a commitment to a net zero and a climate resilient world. So we really welcome that. Now we've heard from the private sector. Now we turn to the other new major kind of creditor. We're very pleased to have with us from Beijing, Dr. Wanting Xiong. She works at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She's an academic, but she's an advisor for the Ministry of Finance and the People's Republic of Bank of China. So we're very interested to hear, Dr. Wanting, the view that you can bring from China on this new instrument of debt for climate and nature swaps. You have the floor for 7 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. We have so many illuminating ideas that we can learn in Beijing. Today, I would like to share with you about my understanding of the debt for nature swap plans in the Belt and Road Initiative context and their connections with China's current debt governance and climate policy. Before we go into debt for climate swaps, maybe let me start with an introduction to the current status of China's policy on these two issues, debt governance and climate change. In the area of global debt governance, I have to say that China is still a newcomer. Although we have become one of the most important creditors to many developing countries in recent years, we are not as experienced as other creditors when it comes to debt treatment. It is not a shame to admit that we have a lot to learn and a lot to catch up. But the good news is that many exciting progresses have been made in recent years. We have become more multilateral, more transparent, and also more ESG oriented. In 2020, we joined the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, providing liquidity support worth more than $2 billion to low-income countries. This marks an important milestone for both China and other G20 countries. Also, we joined the G20 Common Framework on Debt Treatment, conducting debt negotiation under a multilateral and transparent framework. And also in this September, President Xi announced that we will provide more support for other developing countries in developing new and low-carbon energy. And we will no longer build coal-fired power plants outside China. As a middle-income economy in transition, our climate actions are still in a very early stage, but we are making more commitments. We have enhanced our climate commitments and put forward a clear time schedule for achieving net zero goal by 2030 or 2060. Under these upgraded nationally determined contributions to climate change, our climate financing is on a rising path. We now have the second largest green bond market, which has reached a size of over $100 billion. And our MDBs is devoting more resources to green projects. In 2020, over 40% of AIIB's total financing was allocated towards climate-related projects. By 2030, its accumulated climate financing will reach $50 billion. What is more important, we have been joining efforts with other countries and other multilateral organizations. We now have more opportunities to communicate and to collaborate. We have reached a wide range of agreements, such as the Green Investment Principles for the Belt and Road Initiative. We have set up institutions like the BRI International Green Development Coalition, and we are now putting more efforts in aligning the standards of green investment across different countries. I will say that against these backgrounds, I see a very promising future for the debt for nature swap or the debt for climate swap plans in the BRI context. These plans have great potentials in helping developing countries dealing with their debt distress and also cope with climate challenges. They are also in line with China's green investment preferences. Nevertheless, I would say that we have to bear in mind that there are still challenges ahead. I agree with other speakers in that they see the debt for nature swap as a complement to the current debt treatment schemes rather than a replacement. As a new creditor, China has little experience with these types of debt swaps. This require more multilateral collaborations and maybe also in technical support from institutions like the IMF. And the third point is that the debtor countries may also need a collective framework for selecting and constructing good green projects, which is these projects are the cornerstone for sustainable and productive investment. And the last thing is that there are still huge financing gaps closed. We urge the developed countries to deliver and maybe even increase their climate financing commitment for developing countries. Lastly, I have to say that my talk only reflects my own views, not the views of my agency and nor the views of the Chinese government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wan Ting. And it's very interesting and heartening to hear that China is discussing actively these important topic of climate for nature debt swaps and looking at them as a possible way of supporting developing countries through the Belt and Road Initiative. So now we have, I think it's exactly 10 minutes for question and answer and comments before my director, Dr. Andrew Norton, will conclude with some closing remarks. So we open up to people from in the audience, online, who want to send some questions in the chat, or other speakers on the talk who want to ask a question. So would anyone like to kick off?
Can I make an additional comment?
Okay, well maybe I could. Do we have Minister Ibrahim Amir still on the line? Maybe I could ask him a question. It sounded like at the beginning of the discussion you started out as a bit, frankly, of a skeptic about this approach, and you were concerned about access to the markets for for Maldives, apologies. So from what you've heard from Sonia from the International Institute for Finance in terms of the private sector, from what you heard from Stephanie about having a dialogue with credit rating agencies, from what you've heard from the other speakers, Honourable Minister Amir, in terms of your concerns in the Maldives, have we managed to convince you that this might be a useful approach to look at, maybe combining and blending some kind of swap with access to new green finance, as some of our speakers alluded to? Are you online, Minister Amir?
Yes.
Actually, I wanted to come in and make a comment about that also. So, really, in 2020, early 2021, we were working on a debt for nature swap with the TNC, the Nature Conservatives group. And at that time, because of the COVID-19 situation, our secondary market rates were at a discount, right? And we were working with them and the UNDP for the debt for nature swap. And we already have a policy where which is called the Nuraj program, Blue Maldives. And in that we have already committed to conserving 20% of our reefs within the EEZ. So we were working on that. But because it took a time, we went into the market and we issued a sukuk, and there was a tender offer, and we managed to pay what is due in 2022. So now what is happening is we don't have a debt for swap, because already 90% of our debt is very concessional, and the sukuk that is trading in the secondary market is at a premium. So that is the point that I was trying to make. So if, let's say, for example, with DSSI also you have the official bilateral and multilateral creditors, and with the conversations I was having with the rating agencies were very insistent on that if we go for a collective action, anything like that, or if we force private creditors debt restructuring, then they will downgrade us. Actually, as mentioned by other speakers, we continue to have meet our debt service obligations, but yes, because of 2020, our debt to GDP ratios have gone up. So if, let's say, for example, as have mentioned by the honorable speakers, if IMF and World Bank and everybody can come together, and rating agencies are also on board, and if there is a mechanism where the current bondholders now trading at a premium, if they are convinced that they can take a haircut, then I think this is a very good idea. You know, we can go ahead with that. Even before this conversation, this discussion, we were actually doing this. But we went to the market, and because of the liquidity pressures, we managed to do that in a market-friendly way. So that's what I wanted to highlight. And also the other speakers mentioned about ESG considerations from the private investors. Maldives is a country very much dependent on the oceans, blue economy. When we talk about ESG bonds, blue funding, green funding, whatever it is, at the end of the day, honestly, we don't get the cost of finance is still the same if you go to the market and issue a conventional bond. So even if we have these many colors, for countries very challenged with climate change issues, still, you know, as the Minister of Finance, you look at the cost of borrowing, whether it is green or blue or orange or whatever it is, the cost of borrowing is still the same. I think the international community, the private investors, everyone must come together and make sure that for climate adaptation projects and other things, for ESG securities, the cost of borrowing should be really at a very concessional rate. Now it is not. Now it is only a marketing gimmick.
Thank you very much, Minister. So it's interesting to hear that you were actually already considering this approach, and then COVID happened and circumstances changed, but you have already got this approach. But I was also encourage you to think towards this budget approach about you know, not having an independent trust fund, but actually having the money on budget so that you can link it to KPIs and not just spend it, although it's very important, not just spend it only on climate and nature, but also on some of your other fiscal priorities like COVID and post-COVID recovery. But I noticed that Stephanie would like to make a quick comment. So Stephanie, I can give you literally 3 minutes if you want to make a quick comment, please.
I'll try to do less time. Thank you very much. I wanted to say, firstly, just reiterate the point about scale. I mean, I was actually involved many years ago in arranging debt for nature and debt for social spending swaps, and they were very time consuming. So how to reduce the transaction costs and the time that it takes on both sides, right, debtors and creditors. I would like to stress, because it was mentioned that it was a new thing, that creditors are private. In fact, Brady was about debt to private creditors. That's why we studied it, to try and draw the lessons. And I think one of the interesting things was that when it was agreed, it took a long time, about 7 years before particularly the US and the European creditors decided to accept debt relief. And then it fell into what Carmen Reinhardt calls rightly too little too late, especially too late. But once it was agreed by the international community and the mechanisms were set up, some of the deals came very quickly. For example, the Mexican deal happened the same year. And I think that the point that the minister from Maldives makes is very important, that you have to move quickly. So it has to be made more agile, more streamlined. When there's so many actors involved, it's always difficult. But if we feel there is an urgency both on debt and on environment, I think we have to streamline it as well as scale it up. And I think that the issue of the rating agencies is also tricky because they are regulated, particularly in their rating of loans in the developed countries, who are their main clients. And the position of financial regulators of developing and emerging economies is very weak. So there would have to be some international action by key actors, perhaps the IMF, the World Bank, who, or even the governments themselves of the big countries, that would clarify to the rating agencies, who are not really formally very regulated, that if, for example, a deal is accepted by the fund in the bank and funded by creditor governments for good programs, this should not lead to a downgrade, I think. Because if not, the fears of finance ministers in African and in general low-income countries, or middle-income countries like the Maldives, are very genuine and difficult. But as Sonia, I think, explained very, very clearly, I think it can, debt relief and investment in nature can increase long-term debt sustainability. And so if they take a more long-term perspective and if the funds are monitored, then it should actually be a good thing. And so the rating shouldn't be low. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. We've got one final comment from the floor. Sam, introduce yourself and then ask your comment. Is the mic on?
Sam Bickersteth from the Global Resilience Partnership. Civil society played an important role in driving some of the HIPIC debt relief back in the 90s and in the 2000s. What's the role for civil society? Maybe that's a question to you, Paul, as you sit within a non-governmental organisation in playing into which seems what appears to be quite a sort of technical institutional conversation at the moment. Should this be going outside the walls of this COP?
Now that's a crucial question, so that just to repeat the question for those who didn't hear it, Sam was asking what's the role of civil society in this debate, because apart from IID and our colleague from CAS, which is kind of semi-governmental, and Stephanie maybe from a university, well, it's mostly from government and semi-governmental institutions. So what's the role of activists and civil society? When is Greta Thunberg going to stand in the street and say we want a debt for climate and nature swap? So we need to get out there, we need to get mobilized, we need to help bring a partnership together that's beyond the technocrats, so that we have the kind of demands coming from civil society that drove the HIPIC, the whole Make Poverty History campaign that drove Gordon Brown and Tony Blair then to push HIPIC through, to make sure that we get a debt relief linked to climate and nature in the same way under the current heads of state. So I think that's a really important point to conclude on. And with that, I'll hand over to thank all our speakers. I'll come back to that in a moment, but I'll hand over to our director, Dr. Andrew Norton, to give the closing remarks. And you have 7 minutes, Andrew, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul, and huge thanks also to all of the panelists. It was quite an exciting discussion just to hear things actually evolving as the speakers were talking. Just really terrific. I want to kick off with one thought, which is about the pandemic context. And I'm sure you're all familiar with data which shows that there is a severe risk at the moment of basically rich countries being able to kick off their recovery from the pandemic, when many lower and middle income countries can't, which is a truly horrible prospect. We've had a world that's been getting more equal, a world of convergence. If we come out of the pandemic, we're into the reverse of that. That really would be a desperate thing to see. And debt is a big part of that, because the debt problems of many of the poorest countries are preventing, or run the risk really of preventing, investment in a green and inclusive recovery. So just a sense of the importance of that context, really, which makes this discussion, I think, particularly important. At this moment, we're talking about finance at scale, private sector, as well as China and other sources, as well as the MDBs and so on. So really important to deal with some of these systemic problems that could prevent investment flowing in the way that poorer countries will need it. Let me just say a quick word about some of the language. Debt for nature swaps, sometimes in my experience talking to people, brings to mind a picture of a small or boutique scale operation dealing with maybe something very small like a sacred grove or something like that with an international NGO engaged. Now, some of those experiences, like we heard from the Seychelles, have been positive in building a knowledge base about this. But there is a challenge really in shifting the understanding so that this is seen as something programmatic and something that can work at a really significant scale. Because that's not what this is about. This is about helping countries to invest in such a way that they can confront the climate crisis and the crisis of biodiversity loss in an effective way. And there are various challenges there which we've dealt with at different points of the discussion. I think there's the challenge in moving to that really big vision of what the plan is. I've seen some documents which talk about a sort of green and inclusive recovery plan, but I've also seen a sort of reluctance to have more plans out there. You know, we have the NDCs, we have various other frameworks for looking at what the overall kind of governmental direction and plan is, which could guide investment in a debt for nature swap. So how you get to the coherence of the plan seems to me to be a challenge that we need to work on. Then there's also the question of KPIs, which was raised a couple of times and also relates to the really important comments about transparency and monitoring from Sonia and from others, and how that really is key, being able to see that the action that is financed by a debt swap is effective at confronting climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and indeed poverty and inequality. And there it seems to me also there is work to be done. The language of KPIs for me conjures up this notion of moving smoothly from one situation to another. And it's not like that, is it? You're looking at situations where countries may be facing really extreme disruption. So some of the conventional ways of looking at improvements in, I don't know, poverty reduction or even food security simply may not work. The KPIs need to monitor the building of system resilience, and they need to give countries credit where things may have got worse, that the countries have dealt with a crisis situation very well. And those can be two things that you have to hold in your mind at the same time. And we also will need to learn about what works. Some of the things we think in advance may build resilience may actually not work in practice when the shock comes. So it was also great to hear about the Minister from the Seychelles talking about sharing the experience, the incredibly valuable and path-breaking experience they've had in this field, because I think we will need to learn about how to do that transparency and monitoring piece that is so important effectively in an incredibly disrupted and unstable world. And there are real challenges there. And finally, I thought the discussion, it came back in the questions around how this can be done in such a way that access to private finance is enhanced rather than damaged. The discussion about the credit ratings agencies, the Brady experience on mechanisms that Stephanie talked about, and how really important that was. And it was also encouraging, I think, Stephanie talked about how, you know, private investors might also benefit from seeing their actions support more effective actions to deal with the climate crisis. And in that sense, it was also really encouraging to hear Sonia linking that to the ESG movement and the sense that this is something that is material and important to private investors now. And my final comment, absolutely the final one, is this thing about walking on two legs, or I think Jeremy had three legs. But the you know, so he had deep debt distress and then countries needing to build their fiscal capacity to act in these on the climate crisis, and then also climate finance. And just coming back to the point made by the Minister from the Maldives of that this doesn't do away with the need for the rich world to deliver on climate finance in a way that up to now it hasn't. We haven't hit the 100 billion target, which is too small anyway by 2020. So important also to keep that in mind. But huge thanks to everyone. It was a really exciting discussion, quite difficult to summarize quickly, but many thanks to all of the speakers. Thank you, Paul. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Andy. Just to conclude, I mean, it would be great if coming out of this session and the Conference of Parties more broadly, we had a COP deliverable where we linked up the DSSI and the HIPIC learning and the common framework and the experience with the Brady bonds, as Stephanie was talking about, with some kind of international initiative on climate and nature swaps. Just to give one final plug, we're having a session on the 9th of November, a fully virtual session at 2:30 p.m. GMT on the the Development and Climate Days. You can register on the IIED site, and we'll be launching a how-to guide for linking debt with climate and nature outcomes. So please join us on Tuesday the 9th of November at 2:30 p.m. You can register on that site if you're interested. So thanks again to all the speakers. It's been a great session and we look forward to further implementation.